Late on the afternoon of Saturday, March 25th, 1911, the 500 employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company were racing to fill their quotas. Teenage girls, for the most part, eager to finish up, collect their pay, and plunge into the mild spring evening. Around 4:45 p.m., with just 15 minutes left in the workday, someone on the 8th floor must have dropped a match or burning cigarette into the heaps of discarded fabric that littered the shop floor.
Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top floors of a 10-story building, and a fire broke out. Apparently someone had dropped a cigarette into a drawer that held what they called remnants of scraps of cloth, and the fire spread pretty quickly, and the doors were locked, allegedly to keep out union organizers. This had been a company that resisted unionization, was trying to. So with this rapidly spreading fire, there was really very little way to get out, and the result was a horrible carnage.
Within seconds, the combustible litter of cloth and tissue paper had burst into flames, and before anyone could stop it, the fire began to spread with startling speed from one stack of fabric to another, as cries of panic went out and terrified workers scrambled for the exits.
I heard somebody cry fire. I ran for the door on the Washington Place side, but the door was locked, and immediately there was a great jam of girls before it. Some girls were screaming. Some were beating the door with their fists. Some were trying to tear it open. Rosie Safran.
It was horrifying. It was a large loft in which the doors had been locked from the outside. And so when the fire began, the women working at the machines tried to get out of the exits, could not move the doors, and there are accounts of bodies being crushed up against the doors and of women trying to escape.
Most workers on the 10th floor managed to escape, helped to safety across an adjoining rooftop by students from New York University. Hundreds more made it down by elevator, 30 people at a time, jammed into cars meant to hold half that number. But by 4:55, the searing heat had forced the last of the elevators out of service, and with the fire now spreading from the 8th floor to the 9th, nearly 200 women remained trapped in the building with no means of escape. On the 8th floor, workers tried bravely to stop the fire, but the flames were too quick, and the water pressure in the fire hoses failed them. As the searing heat and smoke intensified, the factory floor became an incinerator. And as bodies piled up in front of the locked main exit, those who still could raced for a fire escape on the far western end of the building. Fewer than 20 women managed to get out before the rusted metal supports gave way, sending several workers plunging to their death and cutting off the last means of escape for all the others. With a wall of fire advancing on them, the terrified women moved to the open windows.
The girls behind us were screaming and crying. Several of them, as the flames crept closer, ran into the smoke, and we heard them scream as the flames cut their clothes. One little girl, who worked at the machine opposite me, cried out in Italian, "Goodbye. Goodbye. Tessa Banani."
Outside on the street below, a huge crowd had gathered. The New York Fire Department had arrived within minutes of the call, rushing 35 vehicles to the scene, along with the most modern firefighting equipment in the country. But even the tallest ladder could go no farther than the 6th floor, 2 full stories below the burning factory floors, where tongues of flame could already be seen curling out of the windows.
The fire, of course, like any fire in Manhattan, could be spotted from blocks and blocks around because of the smoke. So there were big crowds on the streets below, and the fire had gone on long enough that people had also heard the word down on the Lower East Side and had come up to the village, waiting to see what would happen. And then it became apparent in this heart-gripping moment that no one could get out except if they jumped.
At 5:05, a laborer named Dominic Cardiani, pushing his wheelbarrow down Green Street, heard a muffled explosion, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Glancing up, he saw what he thought were dark bundles of clothes, sailing from an 8th floor window.
You know, you can hardly believe it when you read about it. I mean, imagine, from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of a building overlooking Washington Square Park, you know, first this great tongue of flame leaps out, you know, and passes by where there's some policeman said, oh, it was just a momentary accident. Then all of a sudden, one passerby said something that looked like a bale of old clothes comes plummeting down from the 8th floor and hits with this thud, which somehow seemed too loud for a bale of clothes, on the sidewalk. And someone said they must be throwing, and it was burning as it fell, they must be throwing out the burning bales of clothes. And then other bodies started to come down. People realized that young girls would go out on the ledge. The flames would be looming up behind them, and they'd jump, of course, to die. Some would try to cling to the ledge with their fingertips, but they couldn't. You have plummeting down to the street scores of burning dead bodies.
There was also an iron fence below, so some of the young women, when they jumped, were impaled on the iron fence. And people who saw it said that they never forgot it, that it was a sight that burned itself on the retina of the watchers.
William Shepard, a reporter for the United Press, called the story in as he watched from a payphone across the street.
I learned a new sound, more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding, living body on a stone sidewalk. Thud. Dead. Thud. Dead. Thud. Dead. Thud. Dead. There was plenty of chance to watch them as they came down. The height was 80 feet. The first 10 thuds, deads, shocked me. I looked up, saw that there were scores of girls at the windows. The flames from the floor below were beating in their faces. Somehow I knew that they too must come down. I even watched one girl falling, waving her arms, trying to keep her body upright, until the very instant she struck the sidewalk. Then came the thud. Then a silent, unmoving pile of clothing and twisted, broken limbs. William Shepard.
By now, dozens of women at a time could be seen standing at the 8th and 9th floor windows, all but engulfed by the inferno. As those below watched in horror, groups of women, 3 and 4 at a time, grabbed each other by the hand, closed their eyes, and plunged off the building. They hit the pavement just like rain, a stunned fire chief named Edward Worth later testified. Frances Perkins, a 31-year-old advocate with the Consumers League, stood with her hand at her throat, helpless to stop the unfolding tragedy.
The nets were broken. The firemen kept shouting for them not to jump. But they had no choice. The flames were right behind them. For by this time, the fire was far gone. Frances Perkins.
By 5:15, the scene on the street was a bedlam, as thousands of workers poured out of nearby factories and pressed against the barricades. Fire engine horses reared at the strong smell of blood, while police tried without success to control the crowd.
The floods of water from the fireman's hose that ran into the gutter were actually stained red with blood. I looked upon the heap of dead bodies, and I remembered these girls were shirtwaist makers. I remembered their great strike of last year, in which these same girls had demanded more sanitary conditions and more safety precautions in these shops. These dead bodies were the answer.
It was over in less than half an hour. Firemen inspecting the burned floors the next day found dozens of bodies. Charred, headless trunks, some still bent over the sewing machines. Among the remains, the inspectors found 11 engagement rings. In all, 146 people, teenagers for the most part, immigrant girls, some as young as 14, had died in the greatest industrial disaster in the city's history.
Some died of smoke inhalation, piled against the doors trying to get out. Some were burned to death, and some jumped out of the windows and died. 141 young women died. And of course, when the firemen finally enter that building, the dead bodies are heaped up against the doors because there were no fire exits, there was no safety precautions.
March 26, 1911. The remains of the dead. It is hardly possible to call them bodies, because that word would suggest something human. And there was nothing human about most of these. Were taken in a steady stream to the morgue for identification. The New York Times.
At a temporary morgue set up on a pier along the East River, relatives lined up to identify the corpses. The ghastly process took 3 full days. Seven bodies were so badly burned, they could not be identified. And on April 5th, 1911, a mass funeral was held for the unknown victims. 120,000 working people joined in the procession, despite a heavy rain, while 400,000 more watched silently from the sidewalk.
A mass emotion of sorrow and despair was felt everywhere that day. But in the weeks that followed, these emotions gave way to angry questioning and a determination that a similar tragedy must never take place in New York again.
A few months later, the owners of the Triangle factory, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were tried for manslaughter having locked their workers in. But to the shocked disbelief of the victims' families, and of most New Yorkers, the two men were acquitted when the prosecution was unable to prove that they had actually known that the exit door was locked at the exact time of the fire.
There was a trial, and the trial found that the owners were not guilty, for they had broken no law. Yes, they might not have been very nice to have locked in these young women, but there was no law, and so there was no repercussion.
Within weeks, the Triangle factory had reopened in a nearby building. Visiting the new plant, fire inspectors found the exit door blocked by rows of sewing machines. But now, something extraordinary began to occur. From the ashes of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire would begin to arise one of the most dramatic and far-reaching political transformations in American history.
It was a kind of a moment that the city could no longer ignore the reality that had been with the city for decades of what a sweatshop was. The whole city felt involved in those bodies that were thudding to the pavement. I mean, you couldn't say they don't relate to us. The impact of this one fire, the horror of the bodies, the number of the dead, had an impact that transformed. It was a turning point in the fight for social welfare legislation in New York.
The Triangle Fire catastrophe, it's an epic event in the dynamics of the city's politics and economy and everything else. In the immediate aftermath, what happens is a mass meeting of concerned citizens. A lot of officials in business put together an operation and go up to the state legislature and say, you've got to do something about this. We need reform legislation to police the workplace and make sure that nothing like this ever happens again.
The key to change lay with the New York State legislature. The key to the legislature, however, lay in the pocket of Silent Charlie Murphy, the inscrutable, taciturn boss of Tammany Hall, and the last man in New York from whom reformers could expect any help. But the reformers were wrong.
Silent Charlie was an extremely shrewd politician, and he understood that the demographics of the city were changing, that you couldn't simply win by appealing to the Irish vote, that you had to make some attempt to draw in Jews, Italians, other new immigrants, that you had to worry about competing politicians, particularly Socialist Party, and also progressive Republicans, that you had all these people now in settlement houses and progressive reformers who were also a part of the political scene. And I think that what Murphy understood was that somehow Tammany had to adapt to the new realities of the city, the new political realities.
To the amazement of the reformers, whose efforts had been stymied by Tammany at every turn, Murphy supported the call for an investigation, then placed two of his closest protégés on it. Robert F. Wagner Sr., the leader of the state Senate, and 38-year-old Al Smith, now head of the state assembly. The grueling 4-year-long factory investigation that ensued would make Smith's career and change forever life in New York. Week after week, month after month, the Factory Commission ground on, taking testimony from fire inspectors, sanitation experts, health officials, and labor leaders. Calling in its first year alone more than 200 witnesses, then launching an unprecedented statewide tour of factories, beginning with New York.
This Factory Commission started to tour the state. And the reformers couldn't help noticing that no matter how hard the trip was, everyone would miss one trip or another. Al Smith never missed a trip. They couldn't help noticing his face when they would go to these factories and they'd see these rooms without a window in which mothers with their children worked 7 days a week. They remembered going to one factory where the owner assured him he had no children working, and then someone pointed them to an elevator, and he had put all the children in an elevator and put it between floors so nobody would see them. Then it came time for the Factory Commission to write its laws. And Smith sat at the table. He was very conscious of his lack of education. And he said, you make the recommendations, I'll fight for them. And it was a very wonderful and dramatic thing. The reformers had gone up to Albany for years and had never gotten these proposals for child labor laws, for women's labor laws, for wages and hours laws, for factory compensation, for disability compensation passed. Now they sat up there in the galleries of the assembly, and down there on the floor was this man they despised, fighting for them and getting these things through. And for the years to come after that, Al Smith was the weapon of reform in New York. He was the red-faced, loud-voiced, paunchy Tammany henchman who got through the dreams of social welfare reforms for which reformers have been dreaming now ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
The resulting flood of legislation, one man later said, was nothing less than epoch-making. Landmark laws affecting not only fire protection, but every aspect of factory life. Plant owners would now be required to provide enclosed staircases, fire sprinklers, and adequate lighting, ventilation, and washrooms. Dangerous machinery would be regulated by law. Women would not be allowed to work more than 54 hours a week. Children under 14 would not be allowed to work in factories at all.
And the logjam is broken. And what you get in 1913 is a flood of progressive legislation. At the heartland of it all is indeed safety regulations. But there's a tremendous raft of new laws, and Wagner and Smith are at the heartland of this. They introduce something like 60 bills, of which 56 get passed. And the political center of gravity of the city and the state, as a consequence, is profoundly shifted.
Business interests were outraged. To own a factory in New York is now a calamity, the leaders of the real estate board declared. But nothing could stop the momentum of the campaign Al Smith was now leading, with almost evangelical fervor, to use the power of the state to change people's lives.
Well, in other words, politics is not simply now about helping people out when they're in need, or giving them the coal to get through the winter, or helping them get a job when they're unemployed. It's now about using the power of the state government to really get at some of the underlying problems of city life. The point here is that machine politicians find that it's in their own interest to begin to think about politics in a less parochial way, and ultimately in a more national way. What can we do when we control the city or the state or the Congress to make people's lives better? How can we improve working conditions? How can we improve housing conditions? How can we improve educational opportunities?
As the subway had brought New Yorkers together physically, so the grief and horror of the Triangle Fire brought them together emotionally and spiritually. We banded ourselves together, Francis Perkins later wrote, moved by a sense of stricken guilt, to prevent this kind of disaster from ever happening again. In the years to come, as the leaders of the Factory Investigating Commission moved into positions of power in City Hall, in Albany, and eventually in Washington, the remarkable alliance would become an unstoppable engine for change, not only in New York, but across the nation. Looking back, Francis Perkins, appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt as the first Secretary of Labor and the first woman cabinet member in American history, would say simply, the New Deal began on March 25th, 1911, the day the Triangle Factory burned.